People used to laugh every time I told him I owned 4/10 of an acre of swamp tucked behind an abandoned freight spur outside the little town of Ash Hollow. Not a friendly laugh either. More like the kind people say for someone they think made a bad life decision years ago and still hasn't figured it out. They'd wrinkle their noses and ask why I hadn't dumped it for whatever pennies someone offered. And, honestly, if you only looked at it from the road, I couldn't blame them. It was nothing but standing water, cattails taller than a pickup truck, mosquitoes that could probably carry away a small dog, and an old chain-link fence that leaned just enough to make you wonder if it was still doing its job. But that patch of soggy ground belonged to my grandfather before it belonged to me, and every time we walked it together when I was a kid, he'd tap his cane into the mud, grin like he knew something nobody else did, and say, "Son, never judge land by what it looks like today. One day this place will speak louder than every rich man around it." I never understood what he meant, not when I was 12, not when I inherited the property after he passed, and certainly not years later when everyone around town kept telling me I should finally sell it. I had a modest little house across the gravel road, worked maintenance at the county school district, paid my bills, minded my own business, and I honestly thought that was enough. Until the morning the black SUV rolled into my driveway. It wasn't the kind of vehicle you usually saw out there. Spotless paint, polished chrome, expensive enough that it probably cost more than my entire property. And out stepped a man wearing shoes so clean they looked offended by dirt. He walked toward me without introducing himself, looked over my shoulder at the swamp instead of looking at me, and smiled the kind of smile that never reaches someone's eyes. "You're Mr. Carter?" he asked. "I am," he nodded once. "Name's Preston Hale. My company just bought the old Miller farmland next door, rebuilding Briar Point Preserve. Luxury homes, private walking trails, waterfront lots, the whole package." He spread his arms like he was unveiling the eighth wonder of the world, then his smile tightened. "Only problem is, your property." I glanced back at the swamp. "What's wrong with it?" He laughed under his breath. "It's ugly." That was his entire explanation. Ugly. Then he pointed toward my rusted fence like it had personally insulted him. "Our buyers don't want to look at this. We'd like to buy you out." I asked him how much. He gave me a number that sounded impressive until you realized it wouldn't even buy a small condo 2 counties over. I chuckled and shook my head. "Not for sale." He blinked once, clearly not used to hearing that word. "Come on. It's a swamp, still mine." His jaw flexed for just a second before he forced another smile. "Think about it." I told him I already had. He climbed back into his SUV, but before shutting the door, he looked right at me and said something I wouldn't forget. "Everybody has a price. The stubborn ones just cost more." Looking back now, that wasn't a prediction. It was a threat. The letters started showing up less than 2 weeks later. Environmental complaints. Notices claiming stagnant water posed health risks. Code enforcement wanting to inspect structures that had stood untouched for 40 years. Surveyors suddenly questioning where my access road crossed an easement that had never been disputed before. Every single problem somehow pointed back toward the same development company. At first I tried giving people the benefit of the doubt because mistakes happen. Paperwork gets mixed up. Inspectors get assigned randomly. But after the 6th notice in 2 months, even my mail carrier joked that somebody in town must really hate me. Preston wasn't trying to beat me in court. He was trying to exhaust me. Every visit meant taking time off work. Every certified letter meant another filing fee. Every inspection meant another afternoon proving I hadn't done anything wrong. This is a psychological trap. People with money often understand that pressure works better than arguments, because if they can make everyday life miserable enough, eventually you convince yourself that surrender is cheaper than standing your ground. My neighbors started asking why I didn't just sell. My sister thought I was being prideful. Even a couple of friends quietly admitted they'd probably take the money and move on. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was being stubborn. But every time I looked at that swamp, I heard my grandfather's voice echoing in my head, and something inside me refused to let another man decide what my family's land was worth. Then things got uglier. One morning, I found bright orange paint sprayed across sections of my fence. A week later, someone had dumped broken concrete near the property line. My driveway entrance somehow ended up blocked by construction equipment, by accident. Funny how accidents always seem to happen in only one direction. I confronted Preston one afternoon after spotting him touring the neighborhood with investors. He smiled before I even opened my mouth. "Still holding out?" he asked. I said, "You spending all this money trying to push around one swamp owner?" He leaned closer, lowered his voice and said, "I'm protecting a $50 million investment. Don't confuse yourself with being important." Then he walked away laughing while his investors chuckled right behind him, like I was just another obstacle waiting to be bulldozed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked into my grandfather's old workshop behind my house, mostly looking for old survey maps that might help with another inspection. And after digging through shelves covered in decades of dust, I noticed a dented gray metal file box I'd somehow ignored for years. Across the front, barely visible beneath the rust, someone had written 2 words in faded black paint, "Rail Permits." And underneath, almost completely worn away, was a single date that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. 1948. Now let me hit pause for a second, because this is where a lot of people misunderstand how situations like this actually work. Everybody assumes that if a developer has enough money, enough lawyers, and enough influence, they can simply erase whatever came before them. But that's usually not how property law works. According to standard procedure, every parcel of land carries a history, and sometimes that history includes permits, easements, or grandfathered rights that survive long after the original purpose disappears. From a legal perspective, if an old industrial use was established legally and never properly terminated under state or federal regulations, that right may still exist, even if brand new neighborhoods spring up around it. That's why digging through old records can be worth far more than arguing with someone in an expensive suit. At the same time, don't overlook what Preston was doing to me, because this is a psychological trap. Overwhelm one person with paperwork, inspections, delays, and constant pressure, then make them believe giving up is the only reasonable choice. Most people don't lose because they're wrong. They lose because they're exhausted. The lesson here is, before you assume you're powerless, make sure you actually know what rights came with your property, because sometimes the strongest weapon isn't money or revenge. It's a document that's been quietly waiting in a dusty box for 70 years. I carried that metal box into the kitchen like it was made of glass, brushed away decades of dust, and started laying everything across the table one sheet at a time. Faded engineering sketches, correspondence from a rail company that hadn't existed in over half a century, inspection reports signed by men whose names were probably carved into headstones by now, and then there it was. The document that made me stop breathing for a second. It wasn't just an old permit, it was an active industrial rail siding authorization with renewal language that tied its validity to continuous legal existence rather than the age of the surrounding neighborhood. I must have read the same paragraph 10 times because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The next morning, I drove to the county records office expecting someone to laugh me out of the building. But instead, an older clerk adjusted his glasses, disappeared into the archives for nearly an hour, then came back carrying another binder thicker than a phone book. He laid it on the counter, pointed at several matching entries, and quietly said, "Well, I'll be damned." I asked him what that meant. He looked at me over the top of his glasses and said, "It means your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing." That wasn't enough for me, though. I wanted certainty. I contacted a retired rail surveyor who had spent 40 years working freight corridors across the state. He studied the paperwork, walked the property with me, scraped moss away from old rail hardware half buried beneath the weeds, and finally smiled the same way my grandfather used to. "These aren't decorations," he said. "This siding never legally died." A transportation consultant confirmed the same thing, and after another week of paperwork, the State Transportation Office issued a written acknowledgement that the industrial designation remained recognized under existing regulations. Suddenly, the swamp everyone mocked wasn't just a swamp anymore. It was one of the only legally recognized industrial rail access points within miles of a booming residential expansion. I didn't celebrate. I didn't call Preston. I simply made one phone call to a regional freight logistics company that had been searching for temporary overnight overflow capacity while a larger terminal underwent renovations. The operations manager actually laughed when I described what I had. "You're telling me you've got an active siding that close to the interstate?" he asked. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." 3 days later, they walked the property. 5 days after that, they offered me a lease that would pay more in 1 year than Preston had offered to buy the entire property. The first trucks arrived before sunrise on a Monday. Then came portable lighting towers, then forklifts, then generators. By Wednesday, enormous steel containers were stacked beside the old spur while crews cleared brush that hadn't been touched in decades. Watching all that happen felt surreal. The same ground everyone called worthless suddenly became one of the busiest places in the county. Every evening after sunset, floodlights turned the old swamp into a sea of white light. Diesel engines idled with a deep mechanical growl. Backup alarms echoed through the night. Steel chains rattled. Forks lifted cargo. Air brakes hissed. It wasn't chaos. It was industry, completely legal, completely documented, and completely impossible for Preston to ignore. The first time he came charging across the property, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He jumped out of his SUV before it even stopped moving. His face was bright red. "What the hell is this?" he shouted over the sound of a forklift unloading containers. I folded my arms. "Looks like freight operations. You can't operate an industrial site next to my subdivision." Actually, I reached into a folder I'd intentionally brought with me, handed him a certified copy of the permit, then another document from the State Transportation Office. Apparently I can. He scanned the papers so fast I don't think he actually read them. This has to be a mistake. That's what I thought too. I'll have this shut down by Friday. I smiled. Good luck. The lawsuit started almost immediately, but every emergency motion his attorneys filed ran into the same wall. Existing rights, historical designation, transportation authority. Every agency he contacted sent back essentially the same answer in slightly different language. The operation complied with applicable regulations. The permit remained valid. Local zoning couldn't simply erase protected transportation use that had been lawfully established decades earlier. Preston shifted strategies. He organized town meetings where residents complained about noise. He hired consultants to talk about declining property values. He flooded local newspapers with opinion pieces claiming industrial activity had no place beside a modern community. Cameras showed up. Reporters interviewed angry homeowners standing in front of expensive houses, while freight equipment hummed in the background. They expected me to apologize. Instead, I calmly explained that my land hadn't changed. They built luxury homes beside an existing industrial designation without checking its history. That answer spread faster than any press release. Buyers started asking uncomfortable questions. Realtors struggled to reassure nervous clients. Contracts that had looked guaranteed suddenly became uncertain. Every week, another sold sign quietly disappeared. Then another. Then another. The beautifully staged model home that had once been filled with champagne glasses and smiling salespeople slowly emptied until only furniture remained sitting beneath spotless windows that now reflected towering light poles from my property every single night. One afternoon, I saw Preston standing alone outside that model home staring toward the freight yard. He looked exhausted, not angry anymore, just defeated. He walked over without the expensive confidence he'd worn the first day we met. "You planned this?" he asked. I shook my head. "My grandfather did. Decades before either of us knew this neighborhood would exist." He looked down at the documents I'd once handed him, then back toward the containers being loaded under bright lights. "You could end this." "I could. Then why don't you?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Because you spent months trying to convince everyone that my property had no value. Now you're asking me to give away the very value you tried to erase." He didn't have an answer for that. He simply stood there listening to another freight truck shift gears before quietly walking back toward his SUV. Within months, investors began distancing themselves from Briar Ridge Preserve. Construction slowed. Several planned phases were postponed indefinitely. Rumors spread that financing had tightened after too many buyers backed out. And while I never celebrated another person's financial loss, I also couldn't ignore the irony. The man who believed money could bulldoze history had been stopped by history itself. These days, every evening I sit on my porch with a cup of coffee and watch cranes lift containers beneath lights bright enough to turn midnight into afternoon. The swamp still smells like wet earth after the rain. Frogs still sing between the rumble of diesel engines. Herons still land along the water's edge as if none of the human drama ever mattered. Sometimes I think about my grandfather standing out there with his cane buried in the mud, smiling at a future nobody else could see. And every time another train eases past that old siding, I hear his words all over again. "One day this land will speak louder than every rich man around it." He was right. It didn't need revenge. It didn't need anger. And it certainly didn't need shouting. It only needed someone patient enough to listen until the land finally told its own story. People still ask me if I'd do it all over again. And the funny thing is, they usually ask the wrong question. They ask whether the lease payments were worth it, whether watching that development struggle gave me some kind of satisfaction, whether I felt like I'd finally won. Truth is, none of those things mattered nearly as much as people imagine. Money helps, sure, Nobody's going to pretend financial security isn't a blessing. But if this whole story had only been about dollars, I probably would have sold the property the first day Preston showed up. What changed everything wasn't the permit, or the trucks, or the freight company. It was realizing that I didn't have to let someone else's opinion determine the value of something that belonged to my family. That's a lesson far bigger than one little swamp. According to standard procedure, developers, HOAs, investors, and local governments all operate inside systems that rely on records, history, and documented rights. Most of the time, those systems work exactly the way they're supposed to, but they also assume property owners actually know what they own. Too many people inherit land, sign papers they never read, or trust someone else's interpretation without ever opening an old filing cabinet or visiting the county archives themselves. From a legal perspective, every deed, easement, survey, permit, covenant, and historical record tells part of the story. And if you ignore those pieces simply because they're old, you might accidentally throw away rights that took generations to preserve. My grandfather understood that. He wasn't wealthy, he wasn't a lawyer, and he certainly wasn't trying to outsmart anybody. He simply believed that stewardship meant leaving behind more knowledge than money. Looking back, I don't think he kept those files because he expected a fight. I think he kept them because he believed someday someone would need the truth more than they needed convenience. Preston never really understood that difference. He saw every problem as something that could be solved with a bigger check, a louder lawyer, or more pressure. And that's exactly why he kept making the same mistake. This is a psychological trap. When success comes too easily for too long, it's tempting to believe resistance only exists because people haven't been pushed hard enough. That's how arrogance quietly replaces judgment. Instead of asking, "What don't I know?" people start assuming they already know everything worth knowing. Preston never investigated the history of the land because he had already convinced himself history didn't matter. In his mind, my property wasn't a place with a story. It was simply an obstacle standing between him and another profitable phase of construction. Ironically, that single assumption ended up costing him far more than simply respecting one stubborn landowner from the very beginning. I don't hate the man, and I don't wake up every morning hoping he remembers what happened. Life's too short for that. If anything, I hope he learned something from it, because communities don't become stronger when neighbors try to overpower one another. They become stronger when people understand that respecting someone else's rights protects everyone's rights in the long run. The lesson here is, never underestimate quiet people, never underestimate old paperwork, and never mistake kindness for weakness. Sometimes the strongest response isn't yelling, threatening, or trying to get even. Sometimes it's patiently learning the rules better than the person trying to intimidate you. That's exactly what my grandfather handed down without ever saying it directly. So now I'd like to hear what you think. If you were standing in my boots, would you have sold the swamp the first day and walked away with the money? Or would you have held your ground even if everyone around you thought you were making a terrible mistake? And here's another question that always starts interesting conversations. Do you think developers should be required to investigate historical property rights more carefully before building entire neighborhoods? Or is it ultimately the buyer's responsibility to know what's already there? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I read far more of them than people probably realize, and some of the best discussions happen when folks respectfully disagree. If you enjoyed stories where patience, common sense, and knowing your rights matter more than brute force, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more true-to-life property conflict stories, and I'll see you in the next one, because sometimes the smallest piece of forgotten land has the loudest story left to tell.